Everything's a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, copy. Deja vu.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Deja Reviewed podcast, where we talk about the original versions of TV shows that were later rebooted. This is season 1, which we're calling In the Zone, discussing the Twilight Zone. I'm Michael.
And I'm Mark.
And today we're talking about season 1, episode 23, titled A World of Difference. And this episode originally aired on March 11th, 1960. It was directed by Ted Post, written by our old friend Richard Matheson, and starring Howard Duff, David White, and Frank Maxwell.
There is a fifth dimension.
Both shadow and substance.
Suddenly up ahead.
You're moving into what lands another dimension.
Next stop, the Twilight Zone.
Okay, and here is Rod Serling's opening voiceover from A World of Difference. You're looking at a tableau of reality, things of substance, of physical material, a desk, a window, a light. These things exist and have dimension. Now this is Arthur Curtis, age 36, who also is real. He has flesh and blood, muscle and mind, but in just a moment we will see how thin a line separates that which we assume to be real with that manufactured inside of a mind.
And the IMDb description is: a businessman sitting in his office inexplicably finds that he is on a production set and in a world where he is a movie star. Uninterested in the newfound fame, he fights to get back to his home and family. Which is what happened in this episode.
Kind of. I mean, I don't think it's that sort of implies that he has like a choice. He's like, oh, I could be this famous actor, or I can have my regular life. And it's more like he's confused because everyone thinks he is this actor and frustrated that no one will believe him that he's not.
Yes, and I didn't see a whole lot of fame out of this.
Well, he apparently was a big star, though, from the context. And they have like the, what was the guy's name? Brinkley, who seems like he was some kind of like studio executive. Because at first they didn't want to call him like, oh, if Brinkley hears about this, he'll pull the plug. And then turned out to be kind of more a sympathetic character. But they talk about, that they've had to cover up stuff for him before. I got the sense he was like kind of a big deal and one of those where the studio has covered a lot of indiscretions because he made him a lot of money. And certainly the fact that they pull the plug on the whole film when he can't continue implies to me he's a, decent level star at least.
So getting right into this, why did I was confused by this episode. I had to watch it a couple of times because at the very end I was like, wait a minute, what just happened? But at one point,
that's the Twilight Zone, Mike.
Yeah. At one point though, he's like kind of run off. He's sort of cracking, and the director says to like a stagehand or something. He's like, should I use the stage phone or something? And he goes, no. We can't let him know, he'll crack or something. So the whole premise of this thing is that this basically was the Truman Show and the 16 millimeter shrine, because he essentially wills himself at the end of this episode into this movie reality because he has a wife that he doesn't like, who they actually call a harpy in this episode. And it was very strange. I didn't know what the director knew of him, or like what was the actual reality, I guess would be my first question. Do you think?
So I guess and I may have just missed things or been kind of dumb about this. So correct me where I'm wrong, but I actually found this to be one of the more simplistic episodes, that it has the twist fairly early on. So we kind of start out with this scene and we're just watching him. And at that point we think that he actually is this office worker and we're just seeing him go about his day and we're waiting for, what's going to happen. And then I want to get back to some of the production here, because I actually really liked how this episode was produced. I thought it was a really well done episode. But then we sort of turn and we see there's this camera and the set, and we realize that the office he's in is just, kind of three walls of an office set, and the other walls open to the cameras and stuff. And that was kind of the sort of twist, is like, we're surprised and he's surprised too, because he thinks he is this character he's playing. And that's until we get to the very end, which I'm glad you brought up 16 millimeter Shrine. It's the same ending as 16 millimeter Shrine. He decides he wants to stay in the movie and kind of magically stays in that world and disappears from the real world, just like our heroine in 16 millimeter Shrine does at the end, where, you know, she ends up on screen living in that world. So the ending's the same, but up till that point, you know, there weren't really any twists or surprises. It was about, you know, there's maybe 3 minutes at the beginning, 2 minutes at the end, and then it was 20 minutes of the middle of him just repeatedly thinking, you know, trying to convince people he is Arthur Curtis, the character from the script,
right?
And everyone telling him he is not. So
right.
I thought it was fairly simplistic, and I wrote a note kind of early on, like, is this just going to be 20 minutes of him saying he's this character and people saying he's not? And then
right.
20 minutes later, I'm like, yes, it was.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And we've said this about some of the other episodes we've looked at before. It was the premise, and then they just showed us a million different examples of this premise. And yes, that was super simple. At the very end, though, he somehow wills his way back into this fictional reality, finds his actress wife, and apparently abandons his child, his actor child, right. Goes with her on vacation. And in the back, it was almost like one of those classic, like you're in a coma and you can kind of hear like the hospital sounds in the background shot. So I do agree with you. There was some kind of neat production in this. And while we're on production, this was written by Richard Matheson, who is a writer he wrote 14 total episodes of The Twilight Zone. This is the fourth we've seen And When the Sky Was Opened, Third from the Sun,
which we liked,
and The Last Flight, which we liked.
So, well, I would say this was continuing in this tradition. I'll, you know, spoiler a little bit. I don't think this script or story was as strong as those ones, which were some of our favorite episodes. But all of those, I think, were very well put together and well directed.
Yes.
Episodes, and I would put this right up at that level. I want to point out two things that are I just thought really kind of cool were with the practical effects. So one of these is, you know, we kind of see this whole opening segment. He talks with his secretary, and I want to get back to that because I thought they did something really clever there. But he talks to the secretary, goes back into his office. He goes over and like adjusts the blinds at the window. So we kind of see out the window. It looks like a, you know, cityscape. And I was like, oh, that looks like a cityscape set, but there's a window and he's looking out of it. And then he goes to his desk and the phone doesn't work. And so he gets up to, go talk to the secretary and then kind of stops and looks over to his side, and the camera, tracks over behind him and kind of looks in that direction. We see he's looking out at the film set, and there's the camera pointing at them and this whole crew of people. And this is one of the least active film sets I've ever seen. There's like 20 people there, none of them doing anything, just all staring. And usually when I'm on set, like people have jobs to do, but anyway, and what was cool was that was from kind of the time he comes back into his office, goes over to the window, sits down at his desk, makes a phone call, then gets up and looks over there. It's all one shot. So we actually saw that wall and established there's a wall there. There's a window he can look out of. And then while he's over at his desk off screen, the Twilight Zone crew is actually removing that wall, putting, you know, getting the film set and all the extras and stuff in position there so that during the same shot, when it pans back over, we can see all that. So I thought that was very cool. And there's a similar kind of effect they do towards the end when he goes back into movie world, where he's at this set as they're taking it apart and kind of sits down at his desk and puts his head down, and then the lighting changes. Still the same shot, and he like puts his head up, and the pictures of his actor wife and child are back on the desk, and the rest of the set is back, and he, you know, gets up and walks out the door, and it's you know, the hallway from what he expects. It's not a set anymore. So I thought those were two just like really, really nice little touches that would have been perfectly effective at telling the story if, you know, they would have just had a cut and, you know, show him stopping, he looks over and we cut to what he's seeing and it's a set looking back at him. But really nice, like extra little flourish on both of those, getting it all done in one shot.
So do you think, though, what was going on with him? Because obviously if he...
You're like, yeah, the production. What the hell was going on with...
Well, and at the very top of this episode, right off the bat, I was like, as an improviser and a teacher, an improv teacher, I always tell people to get to the freaking point and don't waste time in scenes where you're like meeting someone or saying hello and doing things like that. And the first like 3 or 4 minutes of this episode, I'm like, what is the point of all of this like filler up top? And so
hang on a second. You're talking about like the scene with so there's the voiceover kind of in the empty office, and then he comes in and his secretary comes in and they have a little conversation. Is that the part you're talking about?
Yeah. And they're talking about like him and his wife going on vacation and all this.
I actually thought that was really smart. And I agree it's not getting to the point, but it's doing something very clever. Because I actually made a note the first time watching through this that, wow, this is a very different, like the type of dialogue and the pacing of dialogue and the type of performance they're doing is not our usual Twilight Zone style. It's screwball comedy and paced like you would have in a movie from, if we're talking about the 60s, a movies from a decade earlier in that genre. And so I'm like, wow, this is really fascinating that they're like switching it up and going to that genre. And then it comes back and the rest of the episode is acted and performed like we've expected out of the Twilight Zone, which sometimes means overacting, sometimes really good acting, but it's in that rhythm and that style. And so I thought it was really cool that they set it up at the beginning that it's like, because I even felt I feel like I'm watching a screwball comedy, and they were making a screwball comedy, and it was a movie that we were watching there. I thought that was super smart.
Wait, you thought that was a comedic scene at the top? I thought it was just boring filler.
Well, it wasn't comedic, but it's they weren't
pacing.
telling jokes, but the pacing and the rhythm of the banter and stuff was like the setup you would have in a screwball comedy, like establishing the character and his girl Friday, which essentially the secretary was there. And it was noticeably different enough. Again, I thought that it was really clever direction that when it turned out we were on a movie set, I'm like, oh yeah, totally. They were acting like they would in a movie, not like they would if this was real as it tends to be in the Twilight Zone. And it did set up a couple of things that come back later about him going on the trip with his wife and the tickets to San Francisco, which sets up the kind of escape hatch for him at the end when the wife shows up and like, okay, we're going to San Francisco now. And that wasn't out of the blue. It was a callback. So I agreed. It took a while to get going. But then again, when the next 20 minutes was just repeating the same beat over and over, they could have spent another 5 minutes getting going and it might have been more interesting.
Looking at the trivia too, speaking of production of this, and then I want to get to what the hell was going on. This apparently reused music from Perchance to Dream, which was not directed by or written by this director or writer, but was obviously an asset that they decided to reuse. So
yeah, once the show owns the rights to it, you may as well get some mileage out of it.
So I thought one of the things that was so clever about the Truman Show was all of the ways they made Truman not realize he was in this reality. So obviously there was this guy thinking that he was this movie character was in his head. And I think you already mentioned, they made allusions to him kind of being a drunk or like going on these benders. Mm-hmm. So what was happening? Was he just hallucinating this whole thing? Or was he super method and just got so far into this character? Because they do mention his wife is a harpy and she's trying to get money from him and his real life wife.
I think we should point out that we went from a couple episodes ago, Serling coming on camera and saying like, I'll show you I can write for women, to his episode where he was going to show this, where both of us thought it did not really accomplish that and actually reinforce some of the, stereotypes we had about how female characters were executed within the Twilight Zone. And then the next two episodes after that, we've basically just gone back to like the male is protagonist. The females are completely one dimensional and just there to either, give him someone to talk to, like the secretary in the beginning or the wife at the end, or they're like a harpy and, he's in this terrible marriage, which again is a recurring theme by this point in the Twilight Zone. Everyone is in a horrible marriage.
Yeah. So what was going on? Why did the director, why was he trying to keep, clearly trying to keep something from him? Like, did they know that this guy thought that this was his reality? What the hell was going on?
I think this was my take on it. I think you're putting a lot of weight on that one line from the director that I think we could just sort of take to imply that they knew this guy was sort of mentally unstable anyway, like always goes off on these benders. And, I think, imagine the stories you do hear about some actors where everyone's just sort of told like, don't talk to them unless they talk to you first. I'm thinking like some of the more diva-ish big stars, don't tell them about this, make sure their dressing room set up exactly. And I thought it was a little bit of that was the impetus from that line, because everything else in the entire episode supported the idea that he is this actor and, he has this past of like drunkenness and stuff. And I think he just snapped. And I like your term. I actually wrote down the same thing. This is really like the ultimate method acting. He actually convinces himself he is that person. And I think there's some interesting aspects we could talk about with that, beyond the show, kind of relating to modern life. But I thought that was it. And it was fairly simple that he thought, he just sort of snapped and succumbed to this actor persona and forgot who he actually was. And everyone else was trying to explain to him who he actually was. And he was just not going to have any of it. Okay. And so it's kind of a reverse Truman Show. And I made the same note about that because it is an obvious something that references a similar situation. The issue with that is he actually is an actor, but he doesn't know it. Right. True. And they're trying to keep that secret from him and not let him see the cameras and lights and everything going on behind the curtain. And the trick here is like, this would be if Truman, suddenly they knock down the walls and stuff and like, okay, you've been on this show. And he's like, no, I'm not on a show.
Right. True.
So the other things that this reminded me of, and it's a fairly common sort of action device, or spy movie device, is, things where they create a fake world to convince someone that there's someone else. So I'm thinking the opening of the very first Tom Cruise Mission Impossible movie, the Brian De Palma one, where it starts out with like they have this sort of hospital bed and Tom Cruise is wearing a mask and talking to somebody and convinces him he's this other person. So he'll give him the right information. And then he steps out, rips off the mask. They tear down the set and we reveal it was all a hoax. Or the end of the first Captain America movie where they're trying to convince him, like, cause they don't want to kind of shock his brain that he's still in, the 1940s. And instead it's actually like 2010. And the giveaway for him is he hears a radio broadcast of a baseball game he was at, and then sort of like busts through the door and sees he's in this giant warehouse, just inside a set on it. And so those were a couple of other references to this, which is always a fun device. And I really liked at the beginning that the audience, this is another one where the audience is kind of on the journey with the main character, at least at the start. We talked about this in Mirror Image, that I also think they did a good job kind of putting us in Millicent's shoes. Like, we're confused the same way she's confused and getting information as she did. The difference here was we got the information to figure out, oh, he actually is this actor pretty quickly. And he never was willing to buy it.
Yeah, I did say that I agree with you. I had a note that they did do a good job the whole time making us as confused as he was. And maybe still through to this episode, I'm still as confused as he probably was. If we're in our references section, the other thing that ran through my head the first time he kind of sees the crew all staring at him, there's that great, the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air was great at breaking the fourth wall. And there's a great scene in one of the episodes where he's like, if we're so rich, how come we don't have a roof? And the camera just kind of pans back and shows that they're sitting in a set. And it was kind of neat. I don't know if you remember that. I thought that was...
I don't. I wasn't a huge Fresh Prince of Bel-Air watcher, but I love that reference. Yeah. The show that I always liked for its breaking the fourth wall was Boston Legal, where they would,
I never watched that.
So that was something they did fairly frequently, particularly James Shatner and James Spader and William Shatner. But that was to the extent where, they were going to move nights, being broadcast on Tuesdays to Thursdays. And like the coda scene for one of the episodes, they're like out on the balcony having a cigar, which was always kind of how the episodes end. And they're talking about like what it'll be like to be airing on Thursday night instead of Tuesday. Like,
interesting.
That's a show I thought was kind of overlooked. I always thought it was quite funny, but I love like William Shatner hamming it up in full Shatnerian mode. Yeah. And James Spader, I've stuck with The Blacklist probably longer than that show deserves.
Is it still on?
It is still on.
Oh, wow.
He's just such an interesting actor. Like, yeah. I am willing to watch him kind of do anything. And if The Blacklist was terrible, I probably would have stopped watching it. And it's not. It's fine, but I don't think it's like brilliant TV. There's better stuff on, but I just love watching James Spader.
Isn't his name Michael Reddington in that?
Raymond Reddington.
Oh, Raymond Reddington. Okay. Because everyone was trying to convince me to take Kelsey's last name for when we get married. So, which is Reddington. So
is her first name Raymond? Because that would be really weird.
No.
And it also, well, I don't want to do spoilers for that because that's still an actively airing show, but it's it's unclear from actually, I think by season 2, whether he actually is Raymond Reddington or has assumed that identity.
Okay. So, did you notice, I'm just little things in this episode I wanted to point out. Did you notice when he's trying to get someone on the phone, he has a really bad blood blister on his finger?
I did not. Did you notice that the director is an a-hole? like when he first kind of this is right at the beginning when he's like kind of staring at the crew and can't figure out what's going on. And the director gets up and walks over him. This is before he even knew he was the director. And then it turns out it is. His name's Marty, I think. Walks up and like, instead of like, hey, Jerry, everything okay? Or what's going on? He's like, come on, Jerry. Is it so hard to make a phone call? And he's like, he comes up to him like he's intimidating him like a mobster. Like I was waiting for like, that's a nice phone you got there. It'd be a shame if something were to happen to it. Like he's really like just trying to intimidate the actor. I'm like, what the hell is going on?
Maybe it was Kubrick.
Maybe.
Let's take a quick break right now and we'll come back and keep talking about this episode.
Okay, and welcome back from the break. We are still talking about A World of Difference. And Mike, I wanted to just follow up. I mentioned right before the break that I thought the director came off like a mobster. He also had some of just the weirdest acting choices, and I'll also say some of the weirdest lines written for him throughout the whole piece. And I want to highlight 2 more. So one is when Jerry kind of leaves the studio and he's like just trying to go home or something. And the director like yells at a crewman, don't let him get away. Like they're in a car chase or something. Like, where is he getting? Like, do you want the guy to tackle? Like, it was like, is that the right answer to this situation? It's like, we have to hold him hostage. And so he's like super like animated about it then. And then we could get outside, after another nice shot here, since I was complimenting the sort of production where, Jerry's looking for a way out and he's in this sort of cavernous studio and comes around the corner of a studio wall, and they play with the depth really nicely. In the far corner of the shot, there's an exit and he kind of goes into the depth of the shot to leave. Anyway, comes out, almost gets hit by his ex-wife who just happens to be driving through that part of the studio right at that moment I have nothing more to say about it other than it's like a just total writer's coincidence. This would never happen in real life. She's driving through the middle of a film studio, for Pete's sake. But so then he's talking with her. The wife wants him to come home and sign a check for her. They got divorced and she apparently owes him, or he owes her some money, and she's trying to get it from. But then the director comes out, and this was his dialogue. I had to write it down. It says, "We've called an ambulance. Jerry's having a nervous breakdown. I'm not joking, Mrs. Reagan." And I just gave it more intonation than he did.
Yeah.
I wrote in my notes, I'm like, this is like when you call I don't even know if this exists anymore. When you used to call to get the time and there'd just be this like monotone, the time is 8:03 p.m. Like that's what so he went from like, we can't let him get away, to telling the guy's wife or ex-wife, whatever she is at this point, like he's having a nervous breakdown. And we've called an ambulance, with like no intonation, no emotion to it, and taking no action. He just sort of stands there and tells her while Jerry tries to steal her car. I have no idea what this guy was doing, but I think if they just picked a random guy off the street, he A, would have been a better director, and B, would have had like some more humanity in terms of figuring out how to deal with this situation. So that's my thoughts on the on-screen director. The actual director of the episode, again, I thought did a good job.
Okay, well, since we're talking about the on-screen director, I am not in the film industry, Mark, but you are. If you lost a lead actor, would you immediately that day just tear down the set and cancel all production for that show? Or do you think maybe you try and recast?
Honestly, I would say it depends on, what's going on. I think it was also clear this is in the studio era, which just the whole world of production and financing and everything is very different today.
True.
And as you probably, I mean, I know you're not an entertainment lawyer, but you probably hit at some point in law school when they had broke up the studio system and everything. So they're literally not allowed to be the same way they were. But they talk about at this point, he was under contract with the studio. So it's one where basically the studio owned your rights and they're just going to kind of keep throwing in productions. And if that production couldn't go forward and he was the lead on it, I don't know how far into production they were at this point, but it's reasonable that they might have hey, we're not just going to have, because all those people there worked for the studio. They weren't under contract on that movie. They would have been under contract to the studio. And, why are we going to have all these people just sit around and wait to see if this actor comes back together once they make the call that he's not going to get his act together? Either we throw somebody else into that role or we just shut this one down and move all these people, get them going on another project. And so I think it's possible. I think it's reasonable if they were, if that was the first shot of production, then yeah, maybe you try to recast. But if they were several days into the shoot, or halfway through it or something, yeah, maybe they just shut everything down and immediately use that space, starting to shoot something else that was ready to roll into production. Because they just, it's like an assembly line kind of thing.
I think I would have at least given him the rest of the afternoon to possibly come back. Because when he does come back to the office, the set is already dismantled. It was
that's a very efficient crew.
Yeah. Yeah. It was pretty neat.
I do think there was, it's the Twilight Zone, and sometimes there's just going to be these little plot holes. So I don't think you're crazy to think maybe they could have waited, an hour to see if he gets his act together.
Yeah.
But I do think it was effective that they had set up that he frequently goes on these benders, and they were afraid of calling the studio because you definitely got the sense he was on his last legs with them, and one more screw up and he's out. They're just canceling his contract. They're not going to work with him anymore. And so I also wonder I think if we're going to give the Twilight Zone the benefit of the doubt here, that could have been a way to explain that. It wasn't that he's been a reliable actor. He's having a weird mental breakdown for one day and okay, let's give him a day or two to get his act together. It seemed like it was,
here we go again.
He was on thin ice already, and okay, now he's just going crazy in a different way. We're done. We're not going to throw good money after bad.
That reminds me of the story of how Richard Pryor was supposed to be the Cleavon Little's character in Blazing Saddles, the sheriff in Blazing Saddles. Mm-hmm. And he was supposed to be on set, and Mel Brooks called, or they were trying to track him down, and he was in Detroit or something. And they're like, why the hell? This might be a made up story, but I don't think it is. I've heard if it's made up, it's not being made up by me. It's just being passed along by me. But he met some ladies and just flew to Detroit. Went on a bender and flew to Detroit the night before. And they're like, okay, so I guess we'll move on. We'll move on without you. So that kind of made me think.
And that's, he was obviously a big name at that point, and I think Cleavon Little was not, and he was one of the leads. So I'm sure that was not an easy decision to make, but also maybe they're like, well, it's good that it happened at the start of the production instead of 2 weeks in. I know a true story from a friend who was on the set for it, and I will not name the person so we don't get ourselves into any libel trouble.
Can you name the set?
I think that would give away who the person was. One of the leads on this movie, who is a very big star, everyone was waiting. And this was several weeks into production, and all the other actors had gone through their hair and makeup and stuff, and they're waiting for this person who's now 3 hours late for their call, and they can't get a hold of. And finally, they get a hold of the person who is in Las Vegas and said, yeah, I decided to just go with my entourage to Vegas for the day. We'll be back this afternoon. And that did not sit well with the rest of the cast or with the crew.
No, I imagine that would piss people off.
That one I can vouch for was a true story.
Okay.
So yeah, I guess when you're big and famous, you can be a dick until the point where you are no longer famous, and then people will remember that you were a dick and not want to work with you.
Can I pick on some other things of this episode that are pet peeves of mine?
Sure.
So we're watching The Good Wife. I think we're almost at the end of it, and it's very good. It's very, very, but I've been noticing this in Good Wife, and this was very annoying in this episode too. I can't stand, like, if you can't figure out a way to do this, or you don't want to spend the time, when I'm watching one-sided conversations on the phone in shows and movies, and they clearly do not leave enough time for the actual responses that they're getting back, it drives me absolutely nuts. Like, and I get that you don't want to spend a bunch of time, like, but at least some sort of realistic amount of time, or figure out a better device.
You can also just have somebody off screen, like, yelling out the other side of the conversation.
100%
later.
I know, it's annoying to me.
So here's a cool thing about that. The movie All the President's Men, which I think I rewatched fairly recently because it seemed to be taking on relevance yet again in 2019. Yes. And I'll say that's one that I think the story of it is very important. Obviously, it's a hugely important historical moment. It's one that I don't think the film itself has necessarily held up well. And I think that has more to, it's not bad acting. It's not badly directed. I think it was made at a time when everyone was familiar with what had just happened with Nixon, and it kind of expects you to come in with a lot of that context and skips over some steps that, watching it 50 years later, you're like, wait, who is that? But anyway, what I was going to say is that one, a ton of it takes place in the newsroom, and a ton of it is them on the phone, like calling sources and trying to piece together what happened in Watergate. And for that movie, they actually did that is a set, and they installed a working phone system across the whole set so the actors could like call and actually be on the phone. If it was another character like in the back of the newsroom, they're actually on the phone with that character in the back of the newsroom. Or if it was talking with someone else, it, rang off screen somewhere, and somebody actually was talking back, so that the phone conversations would have the right pacing and stuff, because so much of it is spent on the phone. I thought that was really cool.
That is cool. Although that seems like an elaborate way of, like, you're right. Why couldn't you just have someone responding to them just in person?
If you think in some of those parts, there's some like great wide shots of like the whole newsroom.
True.
You'll have like Robert Redford at one point, and maybe Dustin Hoffman's in the background also on the phone, and for them to both be able to kind of act live against whoever they're talking to and hearing them on the phone. I'll say that's also a little easier for your sound editors if you don't have somebody like yelling lines off screen that then have to be cut out and filled in with ambience and stuff. So
yeah,
you would appreciate that as someone who's editing a podcast. And,
yeah, it's true. Another little nitpicky thing, when his ex-wife almost hits him with the car, his reaction is just to jump into the car and just steal her car, because he doesn't really know who she is. And he within the course of a minute, he like quits this film, steals a car, and kidnaps a woman. It was very strange. It was very, very strange.
Well, it made it a little less shocking when he stole another car later.
True. Yeah. And I loved how she goes to stop. This would never work in 2020, because she goes to stop the car and she just reaches over and just pulls the keys out. And like, it was weird. It was very weird. And then a couple other kind of nitpicky things. Just totally unnecessary shots. And with these 22, 25 minute episodes or whatever they are, it's so frustrating seeing completely wasted time on certain shots that they could have used to make these telephone conversations realistic. But one of them was when the stagehand is like explaining to the doctor what's going on. He's like, he thinks he's the man in the film. And it's like, yeah, we get it. We're like,
I'm so glad you put that, because I wrote down the exact dialogues. It was such a waste of time, and over explaining, not trusting the audience to follow, which Twilight Zone, I'll say, has been very hit or miss on. Sometimes they're very, we're just keeping up with it. Sometimes they're a little ahead of us and surprising us, and sometimes we're way ahead of them. And this was one of those. And his line was, "He's convinced he's Arthur Curtis. That's right, the character he's playing in the picture." Like, yes, that's what everyone has just said.
And he was probably
and it's not even like the director calling or the studio exec. It's just some random guy like on a phone,
right,
in like the middle of the set for no reason. I don't even know who he's talking to for sure.
And I think that's the one that took us into a commercial break too. So it was supposed to be this dramatic like swell of music and bum, bum, bum. But instead it's like, yeah, we get it. And if he was having that conversation, he's like, he thinks he's Arthur Curtis. That's right, the man in the picture. It's like, nope, he didn't respond in that time period. And then the other scene, or the other lines or whatever, that I thought was totally unnecessary. He like grabs this girl that he thinks is his daughter, which has bad 2020 connotations. But then as they're driving away, like fleeing this assault, we see the girl like telling her mom, she's like, "That's him. That's the man that like grabbed me." And it's like, why did we need that? There is no need.
Well, didn't you think because they spent the time on it, it felt like there should be some sort of, follow up? Like then the police show up, like, we heard you were accosting some little, right? Like, no, there's no payoff. Although I will say she reacted a lot more normally when a stranger comes up to her than the kid in Walking Distance, who, remember, the guy like sits down and starts talking with the kid, and the kid's like, "Hey, here's my new best friend. Let me show you my marbles."
Yeah, you're not Martin, whatever. That's Martin. I'm or whatever. Yeah.
No,
okay.
I thought her reaction of like running away and screaming. Yeah,
she like screams.
Perfectly appropriate.
Well, and I wonder if the mother would have recognized that it was this actor that assaulted, because if he was as famous as everyone was claiming he was, then maybe she recognized the actor. That's all I was going to pick on.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot more to say about that. Well, when you were talking about the phone, one thing I was thinking about, and I was thinking about this just as a filmmaker, it's really convenient for narrative reasons to be in that period where there were operators, as opposed to today, because like, he could pick up the phone, just hit a couple random numbers, and then he can literally say what's going on so the audience can follow it, and it makes sense in the context. So he's like, "Yes, I need the office for so and so and so." And we're like, he's trying to call that. Whereas if we just saw him dialing random numbers or looking something up on the internet, which I think is the current equivalent, like they show somebody, typing something into their search engine. I was going to say Googling it, except they usually don't use Google. They use some made up search engine they make for the movie. But, they type something in, and if you didn't know that was the name of the company he worked for, you wouldn't get it. Like, I was like, man, I wish we still had operators just to be able to do things like that in the script and like save yourself some time, and the audience knows what's going on. You
can just always set all of your scripts in the 1950s and 60s if you want to.
I had a script that we set in the 90s just to, it wasn't my script, I was directing it, but that we intentionally set it in the 90s to explain why none of the characters had a cell phone, because if somebody had a cell phone, it wouldn't have made sense.
Yeah, there's watching a lot of old movies and premises that are like, oh, if they only had cell phones, this movie would just not exist.
Right. Well, and it is, it's one of those where then it starts to feel a little forced. And the other thing we found out is the 90s is kind of a hard era to set something in the sense of it doesn't have a ton of super recognizable stuff. Like when you do the 80s, you can do the big hair and the neon and stuff, and it's like, oh, it's the 80s, or flip up their Don Johnson collars or whatever, and like 70s, 60s, 50s, all of those eras have some specific looks to them. And the 90s is just kind of like, it's like now, but like a little more grungy,
and
or the pants are a little 80s, higher, lower,
Yeah. And I feel like the 90s went through the beginning of the 90s versus the end of the 90s were totally different looks. Like, there's like, I think a lot of the 90s, I just think looked like the logo from Saved by the Bell, but like it's, like it just, everything had that like sharp edges, colors, like teal and yellow feel to it. But like, that's not all of the 90s. Cause you're right. There's that huge grunge and like, there's a lot
and that's
of different,
like grunge is fairly recognizable, but it's not like everyone was into grunge or that was the whole 90s. Like there's a specific kind of subculture. So you can't just be like, oh, it's the 90s. Everyone's wearing grunge.
Right.
I don't know. That got us off topic here. I'm looking
I'll get us back.
So go for
while
it.
You're doing that. So, because speaking of Google, one of the themes that I did think before I really knew exactly what was going on with this, I thought it was more of a Truman Show type situation. Mm-hmm. I think what would be if he thought that he was actually just living this life and essentially what Truman Show essentially was, if he found out the invasion of privacy that I think is a very big, very topical current issue. We were just talking last week about Google mining our data and just spitting on my Google News feed Twilight Zone article after Twilight Zone article at me. And I don't, of course, we do this podcast. I look on IMDb at Twilight Zone a lot, and we're clearly being tracked everywhere we go at this point. And I think the thought, if I had that Truman Show moment or had that moment in this where I realized I was on a set, I'd be like, oh God, what embarrassing things have I done? Have I been doing? Like that horrifying, like, oh no, who have I trashed? Who have I like, having your whole life exposed to that bright light, I think is, I get why I don't really care that much about data mining. And frankly, I like when ads are directed at me because they're more relevant than just other shitty ads. But I do get why people get so upset to have that bright light kind of shown into their lives. In this case, literally a bright light shown in their life, a stage light.
Right. I think that is a big relevant issue. I think The Dark Knight was maybe in terms of modern films, like really tackling that a little more directly, where he's doing all the cell phone mining and Morgan Freeman is kind of like, you can't do this. There's too much power for someone to have.
That's right.
But it occurred to me that with what you're saying and relevance to the particular moment we're in with the COVID-19 crisis, I was listening to the most recent 538 Politics podcast, which was not their normal Monday edition. For anyone who's following it, it was a special edition where Galen Druk was interviewing one of the authors of a sort of like a how we should reopen plan. And I'm blanking on her name, but she's a professor at Johns Hopkins and wrote it for Johns Hopkins and the American Enterprise Institute, which is like a conservative think tank. And one of the things they talk about is something that, according to, her and her colleagues, the plan that they have suggested in terms of how to guide when things can sort of open back up is doing all this contact tracing, which we've heard about other countries doing and, has been used in the US for outbreaks of various things. And this would be on a much larger scale. But in the past, it's largely been done sort of by person to person, like almost detective work. Like, if I find out you tested positive for COVID, I'm going to go talk to you like, okay, where have you been? Who have you talked to? And then I'm going to go try to track down the people who have been there. And it's, very much an analog process. And now there are tools being developed and being deployed in some countries. I think China, probably the best example, where they can do the contact tracing much more effectively and much quicker through these digital tools. But it's a huge sacrifice of privacy to get that, because they need to be able to tell everywhere you have been and everyone you have been near. And so they were talking about that trade-off in privacy. And that's an interesting question of, and it's one thing to say, yeah, I'm willing to trade off some privacy in terms of what was I searching for on Google in exchange for getting ads that are actually targeted towards things I might be interested in. It's that same question, but a much deeper level of like, yes, to kind of help our societal fight against the pandemic, I'm willing for some agency to know everywhere I've been and everyone I've been in contact with.
Yeah. And I thought Google was actually already trying to do that, or trying to offer up that data specifically to do that. If you have like location, tracking on your phone or whatever.
I think that, so one of the, I think, realizations probably for some people is they may not have been aware that this data already exists in a lot of forms, but kind of doing it on like a nationwide scale and then having a sort of central health agency actually getting access to all that. And one of the points she made, which I thought was, worth thinking about as you're weighing these things, is that it would depend on what the restrictions are and who gets access to it, because there are already a lot of, if this is considered sort of health data, there are a ton of restrictions on what that can be used for already. And certainly there are occasionally some breaches, but generally the healthcare companies seem to have done a reasonably good job of keeping that data tied to each patient and fairly private. In fact, to the point where I know whenever I have to go to a different doctor or something, it seems like it's a giant pain in the butt for them to even get the data when I want them to have it. So anyway, I do think that's an interesting question about the privacy. I like your or comment about the search, because I definitely see that. The funny thing to me is, at least on my algorithm, and I'm curious if it's the same for you, the ads go all in on something.
Yes, like, it's the same ad.
It's not like, oh, here's a bunch of different things you've been searching. Like the other day, I was looking for some specs on my subwoofer, like the subwoofer I already have. and I just wanted like, oh, what's the power draw on this? And so I just looked that up. And then like the next 4 days, every single ad was an ad for that subwoofer. I'm like, I already have it. I don't need to buy another.
I was looking at a mixer and an audio mixer, and I cannot get away from it now. And I looked for a long time too, so you don't need to keep directing ads toward me because I already did. I'm already sick of looking at it and looking for it. So if you're listening, Google, which we know you are, you can stop directing those ads at me, and Facebook. Okay.
Yeah. I've heard from some students, and this is one where I don't really know whether I think it's accurate or not, but where they've said, something that they were talking about that they were not actively searching for, and then something relevant to that shows up, and it's not like that's happening all the time, but like more than would seem to be just coincidence or something like pretty obscure that then, the day they were talking about it then shows up in their feed, and they're like, well, does this mean they're listening to me all the time? And
that is definitely happening.
I don't know.
Because that happened to Kelsey and I a few weeks back. I forget what the specific thing was, but we definitely had not Googled. We were talking about it, and it was scary. And we do have Google Homes all over our house. It's probably listening to us right now. So, and I mean, technically they are always listening because they have to always be listening to hear us use the activation words. So it's
right. Although supposedly if it's a Google Home, they're they're not uploading anything.
Right.
Again, unless
supposedly
they hear the wake word.
Right.
I don't know. I am skeptical of trusting the big tech companies, so it may very well be happening. I do wonder, it seems like one of those things that you'd need to run some kind of controlled test on, because the fact is every now and then there are going to be coincidences, right? We look at so much stuff online that, if I thought right now of some random movie, there's probably a decent chance that sometime over the next 10 years, like something with that related to that would show up in my feed somewhere. Now, 10 years is a long time frame, but I guess what I'm saying is you think about the number of things you talk about or encounter during the day, and also the number of encounters then we have with the media, how many times you're on the computer and seeing an ad or seeing something in a news feed or whatever. And if it wasn't something you had just talked about, you just gloss by it. But those few times that it did coincidentally, let's hypothesize for a moment that it is just coincidence, occasionally those coincidences will happen, but then they're going to take on this meaning. You're like, wait, I just talked about this. They must have been listening. So I don't know. I would be really curious to kind of see a study on it, because it does seem like enough people have stories like that it does make you suspicious, at least.
There's a specific name for that, and I will try and find it and put it in the show notes when I put this one together. Do we want to hear some closing narration, or you got more notes on this, Mark?
I want to just mention two brief things, and then I think I'm done.
Sure.
One is just going back to the sort of gender issues and stuff that we've been talking about over the past couple episodes. When Brinkley is reading from the script, so this is the script of the movie they're making within the episode that Curtis has adopted the persona of, and he describes the wife, Curtis's wife within the movie, and it says, typical of that efficient breed who can manage a household and the children and still have ample time for, and then Curtis cuts him off. But I was like, that in itself is it reminds me a lot of the description of Millicent, where it's like, one of those girls who's described as a good head on her shoulders. And again, it was very different from the description of the male character that Curtis was playing. So I thought that was worth noting, that again, after calling itself out kind of about these issues a couple episodes ago, I think Twilight Zone continues to show some tone deafness towards the way it's treating women.
Speaking of that screenplay, before you move away from it, when they first reveal, when he first shows him the screenplay, it was such a weird choice, because later on they show the whole title, but the revelation that he's actually in a movie, they just show just the words like screenplay or whatever, or like script or whatever on it. And they don't show the whole, like his name as part of this or whatever the actual thing was. And
right,
like,
was it The Private World of Arthur Curtis?
Yeah.
Or something like that was the title?
Yes, exactly. And a couple shots later they do, but I was like, your revelation was just literally like screenplay. I was like, well, it was so dumb. I thought it was weird.
Although Brinkley did have a good line when he's showing him the script, trying to convince him that, no, you're really this actor. See, this is a script. You're playing this character. And he says, Arthur Curtis is dead, and throws the script in the trash. I'm like, that's pretty ballsy. Like when this guy thinks he's Arthur Curtis. I liked it.
Yeah.
And then the one other thing I wanted to mention that I thought was very, very poignant, and maybe this segues a little bit into some modern applicability kind of stuff, is so he's at his house, and the ex-wife is there, and Brinkley, the studio exec, is there. I actually realized they never really say what Brinkley's job is, but that's what I sort of interpreted him as.
I thought he was like his agent at first, but yeah.
Okay. So Brinkley, who does something, somehow connected with the movie business. So Curtis calls the operator trying to find the business. The business doesn't exist. And he kind of like puts the phone down, and he's kind of in shock. And there's this moment where he like looks at his ex-wife, who has been described as a harpy, has been sort of at his throat the whole time. And even she kind of like looks downcast, like, oh shit, he's lost it. And then looks over at Brinkley, and he does the same kind of like look down, like, I don't want to meet your gaze. And then we kind of push in on Curtis, right before he collapses, from just like the shock of this. But it was this really poignant sort of thing to me of like, what do you that's the moment where I think he realizes like he's wrong. Like everyone else is not trying to pull the wool over his eyes or something like, and I think part of it is not just that the business doesn't exist. It's like he looks back at them, and instead of them being like, see, we told you, like he sees them like kind of like uncomfortable with him being gone. Yeah. And it really, that struck me as such a powerful thing. Cause there's the case of losing your mind, and you're just kind of unaware of it and gradually get less and less aware of what's going on. And it feels to me like it would be much more devastating to kind of have that clarity to realize you've lost your mind. And, that reminds me, a lot of, some, mental diseases, particularly Alzheimer's, or various versions of dementia. But it also reminded me of the fiction piece of Flowers for Algernon.
Oh, yeah.
And just the sort of power of that, like when the guy like gets this sort of super intelligence, but he knows he's going to lose it. And like the sort of realization that it's just going to get worse. And I don't know, I found that to be really poignant, and like you felt for him. You wish he hadn't been kind of proven wrong and could kind of go on being deluded. What do you do when you know that what you believe is untrue, but you believe it wholeheartedly, and you just sort of know that you're nuts? And then it was an interesting choice that he's like, well, I'm going to go back to the set and just live in that world.
Yeah, I was thinking about mental health issues when I was watching this episode, and one of the things that you brought up, and I feel like we've talked about this on the show before in some capacity, but I feel like Alzheimer's and dementia and those things, the early stages are probably horrible when the person kind of realizes they're going down that path. But toward the end of it, it's worse for the people that know, like their relatives and their loved ones, because like, it frankly wouldn't be that, except for, I guess when it gets to the point where it's so scary that like you kind of don't know anyone around you. But I think for a lot of, it's not as bad once you're like you said, once you're past the stage of being aware that your mind's not working right, or you're not remembering people you should be remembering. It's that knowledge that you don't have knowledge, which is worse, it seems like, for those, especially for those, any diseases of the brain.
Yeah, I just read a piece in Wired about one of the founders of Cloudflare, which is a pretty big company. And I guess the guy who kind of did most of their initial coding as one of the founders, And he has this, I can't think of the name of the condition, but he has some kind of pretty uncommon, I want to say they said it was like 1 in 5,000 people or something, or maybe 50,000, like, but not one of those so something that's like not super rare, but not as common as like an Alzheimer's or something. And it hit him pretty young, but you gradually, like your brain just kind of starts destroying itself, and it destroys, some of the things that like make your personality. And they were talking about very much that, like, he's kind of not aware of what has happened to him. And so it's really hard on his family and his caretakers. And they made the point that he is fortunate enough to be insanely wealthy because of founding this company. And so they basically built a house designed around him being able to be safe in it and have permanent caretakers and stuff. But he's, I don't remember how old he is now, but I want to say like 40 or something. Like he's not old. And, but hearing from the people who knew him and just kind of watching him change into a different person and how hard that was for them. And in some degree, it seems like it was much easier on him because he didn't know it was happening. And even now it's like unclear how much he understands exactly what has happened to him, or if he understands on an intellectual level, he doesn't have like the emotional connection to the person that had previously existed.
What a brutal last thought. Sorry.
Happier last thought. I thought Marion, the wife who just comes in at the end, looks a little like Sigourney Weaver.
Yeah, she does. I like Sigourney Weaver.
And I like Sigourney Weaver, so it's a happier thought.
Okay, should we wrap this thing up?
Yeah.
All right, the closing narration. The modus operandi for the departure from life is usually a pine box of such and such dimensions, and this is the ultimate in reality. But there are other ways for a man to exit from life. Take the case of Arthur Curtis, aged 36. His departure was along a highway with an exit sign that reads, "This way to escape." Arthur Curtis, en route to the Twilight Zone. I kind of like that one.
Yeah, I dug the end of that, the en route to the Twilight Zone, because we don't really know what happened to him either. Like he and his actress wife, walk down the hallway and apparently are headed to the airport, which doesn't exist. And they're not actually, like, he's just in this very 16mm shrine.
I hope they go pick up their fictional daughter because they forgot about her completely. Let's rank the sweat on this one, Mark.
Well, after a couple episodes without much sweating, this was not people dripping wet, but there definitely was a fair amount of sweating going on across multiple people across much of the episode. And Curtis was sweaty just about the whole time. Again, not drippy, but glistening at least. So I'm going to give this like a 4.
Okay. I'm good with a 4. I had a 3, but I'm okay with a 4.
Okay.
And what do we think about the episode? You want to go first?
I don't, but I can if you want.
No, that's okay. Okay. I'll go first. That's fine. I was kind of landing at about a 2 for this episode. It was, I don't know. I didn't particularly like it. I thought it was, like we said, it was kind of a one note thing. I was disappointed to see that this was Richard Matheson that had written this one, because I thought he'd done a great job in his first few episodes that we've seen from him. So I was not a fan. So I said 2.
Yeah. Can you give me some context of what some 2s and some, cause I think I'm probably around there. I will say the execution of this one, I really liked a lot, and that's not the biggest factor for me, but I think that would probably bump it up like a half star from the story. So
I think the only 2 we had was Mirror Image just a couple episodes ago. And then we have 2.5s. We have Walking Distance, The Hitchhiker, and Elegy. Oh, yeah. Walking Distance, The Hitchhiker, and Elegy. You wouldn't want to go under 2, right?
I don't think I'd go under 2.
No,
I feel like somewhere in there is probably right. I'm trying to think how I feel like it compares to those other ones, which is interesting because when we go back and look at the ratings, I'm like, in hindsight, I feel like I like some of those more than the other ones,
Yeah, me too.
I think I would probably go up to a 2.5 because I like the production.
Okay.
So that's like my vote, but I'm fine with being talked down to a 2 as our average, because I think I'm just rating the fact that I like the production better.
I think we need to retcon some of our ratings of these other ones, but I do think I like The Hitchhiker more than this episode, but not a whole lot happened in Hitchhiker either. Elegy, yeah, I probably liked Elegy a little bit more than this one too. And Walking Distance, I think we screwed up our ranking of Walking Distance because I liked it much better than this episode.
Okay, then let's put this at a 2, so it's at least somewhat consistent with our other stuff. Yeah, I don't think Walking Distance. I know it's been mentioned. I think by you that Ann Serling said that was one of Rod Serling's favorite episodes. I don't think that's one of the best episodes we've seen.
No,
but yeah, I feel like in hindsight, a 2.5 seems a little harsh on it.
Yeah.
Oh well.
Well, it's too damn late now. Maybe when we go through Deja Reviewed, we'll retcon everything. Well, thank you all for listening. This was Deja Reviewed. Oh, Mark, I forgot to let you guess what next week's episode is about.
I like to make you guess. That's a better description. Yeah, what is it?
Okay. Long live Walter Jameson. I bet you can take a guess at one of the characters.
Well, it's going to be really weird if there's not a character named Walter Jameson. I'm fairly sure this is wrong, as most of my guesses turn out to be, but I'm going to guess it's I'm thinking something along the lines of Escape Clause, but hopefully better done, where he has some opportunity to be immortal, but there's a monkey's paw element to it.
Wasn't the guy in Escape Clause also named Walter?
I don't remember. I've blocked that episode from my head.
I think it was Walter. Anyhow.
That guy was horrible.
We'll see you next week. Thank you all for listening. This was Deja Reviewed. Next week's episode, as we said, is episode 24 of season 1 of The Twilight Zone, titled Long Live Walter Jameson.
And Walter is also the name of the guy in Escape Clause. I just looked.
Thank you. See, I'm so good. Feel free to leave us a rating and a comment wherever you're listening to us. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please subscribe. You can find us at DejaReview.com. Oh, by the way, if you do want to watch along with us, this is on US Netflix. Twilight Zone is on US Netflix. And at DejaReview.com, you can leave us a voicemail or a text message, and we hope that you tune in next week.
Deja Review.